From 2016, I've moved to a good home. I leave behind the ice house. Dan Andrews would rather I lived with an ice addict, and that you should too. For some, at the moment, the sex party has more credibility. Drug smugglers from 2015. Drug smugglers in hero worship. Andrew Chan and Myuran Sukomaran were executed for their crime of attempted drug smuggling. We have been told that they had reformed, but they never set out what it was they had done precisely and apologized for it. Partly that is because of legal issues. They had hoped for clemency in even the last minutes. The personal entitlement lobby had trumped their personal responsibility. Had they confessed all when they were caught, they might still be alive today. But they claimed shadowy figures had threatened their loved ones. The focus early on was on ensuring that others were not executed. So Andrew and Myuran took their hit. There is little doubt they had changed. Hugging their executors and singing hymns without being blindfolded suggests behavioural change, but they should have admitted the sentence was right and the laws were just too. Life is sweet, and it is okay to hold on, but faith sometimes means letting go. The lobbyists using the names of Andrew Chan and Myuran Sukomaran are not doing so for their benefit. A college scholarship fund is a good idea in many circumstances, but not for the two who failed to confess what they had done. But the Australian Catholic University have a scholarship for the writer of an essay on the sanctity of life. The scholarship is in the names of the drug smugglers. It is no good reason to break relations with Indonesia, and luckily that is not how the government are treating it. But the press are interpreting it that way. Australia's government lobbied hard to have the executions commuted to another sentence, but the Indonesian government refused to listen, refused phone calls, and refused to discuss the issue. For that reason, Australia has downgraded relations with Indonesia and is seeking to rebuild them, because the dialogue is important, and if Indonesia feel they can walk away at any time, then the system is flawed. But the media are hoping it is a breakdown like that caused by the ABC's inflations of ALP government indiscretions. And the ALP are using names in a cynical way too, politicizing the personal tragedy and misleading the public over how the tragedy played out. Meanwhile, the educators at Castle Hill High School are wrong. They have a flashing electric sign saying the executions were merciless, barbaric, futile, weak. But the government of Indonesia was none of those things. They were merciful with Scott Rush and Renee Lawrence. They were not barbaric, or Andrew would not have had those wishes fulfilled. The executions were not futile, as it is a deterrent to drug smugglers, and it was not weak to proceed against the international calls to not do so. In 1328, England recognized Scotland as a sovereign nation. In 1707, Scotland joined with England to form the Kingdom of Great Britain. In 1759, Josiah Wedgwood founded a pottery company. In 1786, Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro was performed for the first time in Vienna. As opera goes, it is definitely a cut above. In 1840, the penny black, the world's first self-adhesive postage stamp, had postage problems licked. In 1844, Hong Kong police became the world's second modern police force. In 1851, Queen Victoria opened the Great Exhibition in London. In 1884, Moses Fleetwood Walker became the first black person to play in a professional baseball game. In 1900, the Schofield mining disaster happened, when coal dust exploded and killed some 200 people. It had been the worst mine disaster at that date. In the U.S., in 1915, RMS Lusitania embarked from New York City on her 202nd and final crossing of the Atlantic. In 1927, the first cooked meals were served in an air flight for Imperial Airways between London and Paris. In 1930, Pluto was named. In 1931, the Empire State Building was dedicated in New York City. In 1941, Germany launched an attack on Tobruk. In 1945, a German newsreader officially announced that Adolf Hitler had fallen at his command post in the Reich Chancellery, fighting to the last breath against Bolshevism and for Germany. Also, in 1945, Goebbels and his wife killed their own children and then each other because they didn't want to live with reality. On the same day, in Demmin, Germany, 2,500 committed suicide rather than see the Soviets win. In 1956, Jonas Salk's polio vaccine was made available to the public. In 1960, Francis Gary Powers in a U-2 spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union, sparking a diplomatic incident. In 1961, Cuba's elections were cancelled, and Fidel Castro made a Rudd-like backflip, calling Cuba a socialist nation. It is largely forgotten today that Castro had campaigned for Cuba on the promise of making it a modern democratic state. In 1970, protests erupted in Seattle following President Nixon's announcement that terrorists would be opposed in Cambodia, where they were hiding. In 1987, Pope John Paul II beatified Edith Stein, a Jewish Carmelite nun gassed by the Nazis at Auschwitz. In 1999, the body of George Mallory was found on Everest 75 years after he died there. In 2003, President George Bush announced mission accomplished in Iraq. In 2011, Osama bin Laden was killed before being interrogated and possibly embarrassing Obama over Pakistan intelligence links.